I have been the accompanist at Aldermere Conservatory for 31 years, which means I have sat through more recital dinners than I can count, in that same paneled room with the same 3 candelabras and the same view of the beech tree through the tall west window. I have heard prodigies and I have heard disasters. I have watched patrons nod off over their brandy and watched them weep into their napkins, and I have learned, after all that time, not to assume I know which way an evening will fall. I thought I knew that Thursday in November. The recital dinner was the conservatory's autumn showcase, 12 students, 6 courses, a string quartet playing softly through the soup. Aldous Farron was the guest of honor. He funded 3 of our senior scholarships and liked everyone to know it. He was a large man with a large laugh and the manner of someone who had been told his opinions were valuable so many times he had stopped questioning it. He sat at the head of the long table with his jacket unbuttoned, and when he spoke the conversations around him paused, the way water parts for a stone dropped into it. I was at the far end of the room, near the upright that I use for the younger students. My job that evening was to turn pages for the older performers, but I had arrived early, as I always do, and I had poured myself a small glass of wine and settled into my usual chair, the one beside the window, a little apart from the main table. I was 61 years old and thought of myself as someone who had already seen the remarkable thing. I mention this because what follows proved me wrong in the most complete possible way. The first 11 students performed in order: 2 violinists, a cellist, a flautist who nearly knocked over his music stand, 3 pianists of varying competence, and a soprano who brought Farron briefly to attention. Between the 7th and 8th performance, the conservatory's director, a careful woman named Mrs. Aldine Farrow, leaned across the table toward Farron with a slightly apologetic expression on her face. I was near enough to hear. "We have one additional player this evening," she said. "Clara Sane, she's in the junior wing, she's 11. She asked particularly to play tonight and her teacher felt." "A junior," Farron set down his glass. "Tonight's program is for the senior students, Aldine." "I know," she was rather insistent. "Her teacher, Mr. Paul, said it was important. She's been studying independently for some time." Farron glanced toward the far end of the room, where the piano stool had just been adjusted by a small figure in a dark dress. Clara Sane. I had seen her in the corridors for 2 years, a quiet girl, unremarkable to look at, the sort of child you could easily overlook. She was always drawing. In the common room, in the hallway, perched on the stairs. She drew everything: the tree through the window, the curve of a piano lid, the way a hand looks hovering over a keyboard. Mr. Paul had once shown me one of her sketches, a rendering of his hands on the keys, done in pencil, the detail so precise it was almost architectural. I had been impressed by it, but I had never heard her play. Neither, it seemed, had anyone else at that table. "She's a sketch girl," Farron said. Not unkindly, exactly, but with the particular dismissiveness of a man who has already sorted the world into the categories that matter and those that don't. He picked up his glass again. "What does she do?" "Illustrated fingering charts." There was a murmur of polite amusement down the table. "If she can play anything worth hearing," Farron added, leaning back with a wide and comfortable smile, "I'll stand and applaud her with my own 2 hands. I'll make an occasion of it." He said it the way a man says something he is absolutely certain will never be called upon. Mrs. Farrow introduced Clara in a quiet voice. Clara walked to the piano bench and sat. She was small enough that from where I was sitting she seemed almost to disappear behind the instrument, just her head and the tops of her shoulders visible above the lid, and her hands, settling on the keys without theatrics, without adjustment, without any of the performative settling in that the senior students did. She just sat down and put her hands where they belonged. The table had not fully quieted. Someone was still talking about the soprano. Someone else was signaling for more wine. Then Clara began. She played the opening of Schumann's Traumerei, the 7th piece from Kinderszenen, Dreaming. It is not a showy piece. It is not designed to silence a room by force. It moves at a walking pace, The melody folded inside the harmony, the way a thought is folded inside a memory, and it asks for a quality of touch that most adult pianists spend 20 years learning and some never quite find. A tone that is warm without being heavy, sustained without being pressed, present without insisting. Clara was 11 years old. The first 4 bars were enough to stop the conversation near me. Not because of volume, she played at a moderate dynamic, barely filling the room, but because of something in the quality of the sound. I have tried to describe it since, and the best I can manage is this. It was unhurried in a way that felt chosen rather than slow. The phrase rose and fell as though the music had been breathing and was only now breathing freely, for the first time. The table went quiet in stages, the far end first, then the middle. Farron's conversation stopped at the 3rd bar of the 2nd phrase. He set down his glass. I watched his face. I am not sure he knew he was doing it, but he turned, quite slowly, from Mrs. Farrow and looked at the piano. Treumere is perhaps 2.5 minutes long. By the time Clara reached its final bars, the room was the quietest it had been all evening. Not the held-breath quiet of someone waiting for something, just quiet. The way a room goes quiet when it has stopped pretending and started listening. I found I had put down my own glass without noticing. The beech tree through the window was perfectly still. She finished Treumere. There was a pause that reached down and held the room from the inside. Not the uneasy pause of an audience uncertain whether to applaud, but something rarer. The pause of people who have understood, suddenly and without warning, that they are inside something that matters. No one moved. Someone's chair scraped faintly, and the person sitting in it seemed to regret it immediately. And then, without lifting her hands from the keys, without a break, without so much as shifting her weight on the bench, Clara moved into something else. I did not recognize it. That surprised me. I know the repertoire well enough to place most things in a few bars, and what I expected, another Schumann piece perhaps, or a small Mozart, did not come. What came instead was something that felt as though it had grown out of Treumere the way a conversation grows from a question. The same key, the same unhurried quality, but expanding outward, opening into harmonic territory that was more complex, more searching, than anything an 11-year-old should have been able to find. She was improvising. Or rather, I understood this only later when Mr. Paul confirmed it. She had written it herself, over months, in the margins of her sketchbooks between the drawings. She had been composing the same way she drew, not for an audience, not for approval, just because the thing needed to exist and she was the one to make it. The melody moved through a passage that I can only describe as a question asked 3 different ways, each time with slightly more patience than the last. Then it opened into something wider, a chord progression that should not have worked harmonically and somehow worked completely. The way a color placed wrongly in a painting somehow illuminates everything around it. The room was not just quiet now. It was still, in the deep sense of the word, the way a field goes still in the last light. I saw Mrs. Farrow's hand go to her mouth. I saw a woman 2 seats down from Farron, one of the other patrons, a composed and unsentimental woman who had sat through 11 performances with her arms folded and her chin tipped up, lower her hands to the table, and simply let them rest there, open. I noticed her hands because of how they looked, like she had just decided to stop holding on to something. And I saw Aldous Farron. He was watching the piano with his whole face, which is something men like Farron do not often do. The public smile had left him. What replaced it was not an expression I can name easily. It was too simple for that, too unguarded. It was the look of a man who has been startled by something and has not yet decided how to feel about being startled. Clara's piece moved toward its close. The melody returned to its opening theme, the thread from Treumere still running through it, but transformed, deepened, as though the question had not been answered so much as held with enough steadiness that it no longer needed an answer. The final phrase fell into a chord of such particular warmth that I felt the back of my neck change. The last note held. And in that held note, still ringing in the room, softening, going, I watched Aldous Farron rise. He did not stand in the manner of a man making a point. He stood the way a man stands when something in him has moved faster than his consciousness has kept up with, and his body has simply responded. He was on his feet before the sound had died. And then, in the silence that followed, that silence after music that is itself a form of music, he began to applaud. He was the first. He was alone for perhaps 3 seconds, and then the rest of the room came up after him, and the applause filled the paneled hall, and the candelabras threw the moving light of it against the ceiling. Clara sat at the piano with her hands resting in her lap. She did not bow, not immediately. She turned slightly on the bench and looked at the room, the whole room, standing, with an expression I can only describe as recognition, the expression of someone who has said something important and found, to their quiet relief, that it was understood. Farron walked down the length of the room to the piano. He looked at her for a moment in a silence that the applause had not yet reached. Then he began to applaud again, close, deliberately, the way he had said he would, with his own 2 hands. "I never break my word," he said, and his voice had none of the largeness in it that it had carried all evening. It was just a voice. It was almost humble. Clara said, "Thank you, Mr. Farron," with the same calm she had brought to everything else. I stayed in my chair by the window. I did not trust my legs particularly. The beech tree was still outside, and the night had come fully in while Clara was playing, and the candelabras gave the room a warmth they had not given it before, or perhaps they had always given it, and I had simply not noticed until just then. I have thought since about the drawings, about the sketchbooks full of music written in the margins, about the 2 years she spent in our corridors, quiet, observing, recording, the way she drew a piano the way others play one, as if to understand it from the outside before she moved through it. I have thought about what it costs a person to carry something real and say nothing, to wait, not from fear exactly, but because the right moment had not presented itself, and there was no point forcing it. To be patient with your own gift. I spoke to Mr. Paul the following week. He told me that Clara had been writing music for 3 years, since she was 8, always in pencil, always in the margins of whatever sketchbook she happened to have, filling the white borders around her drawings with notation the way other children fill borders with doodles. He said he had seen the books and had only realized, gradually, that the marks were not decorative, that they were complete, that they followed one another with logic and intention. He had asked her to play one, and she had, quietly, in an empty practice room, and he had not known what to say afterward, which was why he had insisted she play at the dinner. She had never performed for anyone. She had simply been writing, for 3 years, in the margins of other things. I have been the accompanist at Aldermere for 31 years, and I thought I knew what a remarkable evening looked like. I knew what I was listening for. I had the categories. That Thursday in November, an 11-year-old girl sat down at a piano and rearranged every one of them. I still think about the way that last chord rang. I think about it when I sit in that room now, which I do most Thursday afternoons, alone with the instrument and the beech tree and the light. It is not a sad thought. It is not even a complicated one. It is simply the feeling of having been present once, at the precise moment when something hidden became undeniably, permanently true.